Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to week number 3 of Java Server Pages JSP. Last week we talked about servlets. We saw servlet lifecycle, and we went into the details of request and response objects. This week, I'm going to continue with servlets. We will discuss Servlet API. We will talk about very important concepts. So let me just tell you quickly what we're going to do today. I'm going to write them down. So last week, we talked about servlet lifecycle, right? So we learned the steps by which servlet comes into existence and how does it get destroyed. Mainly, we talked about request and response objects. With request and response objects, we learned their methods that are used on request and the response object. So we saw how to set content, how to get the writer using the response object, and with the request as well. We saw some of the important methods of the request. So just to have a very quick review of last week, this is actually where we stopped. We talked about the request and response headers. The last thing we did last week was to do a demonstration of a login page, which we will complete today. Some of the other things that you can do using the response object is, for example, if you want to set the status code of your response object, you can do this manually by yourself. For example, if the status needs to be set to OK, you can use these strings as well. Rather than using the integer, you can use the strings. Not found, SCOK. Then there is a send error if you want to send an error. If you do error handling by yourself and you know the code and the message that you want to display to the client, you can do it yourself manually. Today, we will learn a little bit about the send redirect method, which is a very important method here. And there is the status codes. For example, if you want to set the status code using this method here, 200 represents OK, 204 represents no content. And if you move the resource permanently and that resource is not available, you can set the status code to moved permanently, which is 301. I think you are familiar with the rest of the status code, such as 302, 401, and 404. 404 if the content is not found, if there is no such page, if the URL that the client is looking for is not available, you can set the status code to 404. What we're going to do today is our topic is Servlet API. And mainly what we're going to discuss about today is for the first half, We will talk in detail about send redirect and request dispatching. Two very important concepts. Basically, what we did last week, we created a login form, but we didn't complete it. We did use request dispatching to forward the client from one page to another. But today we're going to discuss it in detail. And after that, we will talk a little bit about cookies and sessions and why do we actually need them? How can we create cookies? How can we set them? How can we read them? And why we need them in the first place. However, before I start today's lecture, I'm going to show you the part 2 of your assignment. I'm going to talk to you about part 2 of your assignment. So part 1 is already over. The deadline was yesterday. Part 2, I'm going to show it to you right now. Okay. Please let me know if there is any problem with the voice or screen quality. Okay, please give me a shout so I can fix it. Please let me know. All right. So let's just go to your part 2 assignment. It's the assignment itself is very straightforward. I have explained clearly what you need to do. You will basically stay with the same group. Okay. You don't need to create a new group. What you will have to do is for part 2, you will use the same project from part 1 of your assignment. All you have to do is you have to change your application to use only JSP. So for part 1 of your assignment, you were allowed to use JSP. You could use Servlet. But from week 3, for a couple of weeks, we learned about scriptlets. We learned about expressions. We learned about standard action. We learned about expression language and JSTL. So basically, we learned some alternative ways to create web application, Java web application without writing servlets, without writing Java code in servlets. This is exactly what you need to do. You will get rid of your servlets and instead you will use some of these technologies such as a scriptlets, EL, and JSTL. You can do everything with it. And the other important requirement for this part 2, is that you're going to have to use a database. Your database can have you can have many tables, but it must be at least 5. So you cannot have less than 5 tables. If you want to get full marks, you will need to have at least 5 tables. You can have 6, 7, as many as you want, but not less than 5. So when you go to MySQL or whatever database you're using, you need to create 5 tables. And then you will need to display your tables to me in your report file. So your assignment deadline is 23rd of May. By 23rd of May, you will need to finish your assignment. And this time you're going to send me the report. It will be a PDF file. with your 4 digits student number, last 4 digits. Here is an example. And this time you don't need to send me codes. This time you have to give me your report, which I'm going to give it to you. I have explained how to create this report when I presented first assignment. I'm just going to quickly tell you once again. Here is the template. You will need to write your names in Pinyin, your student numbers. You will have to copy part 1, definitely. So by 23rd of May, you will need to send me part 1 and part 2. And what you need to send me, I have written it here. For part 1, you had user stories. You will write your user stories first, then you will display the screenshots of web pages. I have explained it to you before. You take a screenshot of your web page, whatever your web page is. Take a screenshot, copy it in one page, and then you go to next page. You take a screenshot of your Java code. So for part 1, your screenshot of Java code can be .java or it can be .jsp. Okay, I don't really need .html. I just want to see your .java and .jsp. So remember, first user stories, then screenshots of web pages, then screenshots of your Java codes. I have explained this to you before. This is going to be part 2. Part 2, same way. You add screenshots of web pages, then screenshots of JSP files, and finally screenshots of your database tables. Okay, so this comes at the end. But remember, for this part 2, you don't have .java file. I just want to see screenshots of your JSP files. So I will send you this report file. You will need to convert it to a PDF and change the name and then send it to me. If you have any questions about this assignment, any questions about part 2? Excuse me. Please let me know if there are any questions about this part. You can, of course, ask me questions anytime, but if you want to clarify anything now, just let me know. Okay. So let me open the slides and we'll see what we have for today. Talking about Servlet API. All right, so let's get into our topic. Something very important that happens very often when you're visiting web pages. So sometimes you click on links on a web page and your browser will go from one page to another. You either create a new tab or a new window and you go from one page to another. Other times it's the servlet or JSP that decides when you need to go from one page to another. Here is the normal sequence that happens. There will be an initial request from the client, and then the servlet decides that this client needs to be redirected or forwarded to a different page. It sends back a response, and it instructs the browser how to find the new page. And then generate the response. But in order to do that, there are multiple ways. There are multiple approaches that you can use to forward the client from a page to another. And those approaches have some differences. Okay, so we're going to go through the first approach, which we will see examples of. It's called send redirect. And here is the cycles that happen with the send redirect. So let's go through it one by one. There are a number of steps in the send redirect approach. The first thing that happens is a client types a URL into the browser. Okay, the client wants to go somewhere. So he opens the browser and he types www. Let's say, where do we want to go? Let's say yahoo.com. Okay. And then he presses enter. The request goes to the server or a container. And the server decides that the request should go to a completely different URL. Now, can you think about any situation that this might happen? Why do we want to send user to another page? Can you tell me any situation in which we need to send user to another page? I will tell you one case. This happens. This is a very common thing. Let's say you want to go to your Yahoo and you want to go to your homepage. Usually what happens when you want to go to your homepage, you'll request a URL and then you will sign in. Okay, you will sign in, right? But sometimes what you do instead is you say www.yahoo.com and you want to go to my homepage. Let's say .jsp. You want to go directly to your homepage. The problem is if you are not logged in and you try to visit this page, this is not going to be a legal request, because who knows if you are a legal valid member. Maybe someone else is trying to go to your homepage. Okay, so in these situations, this page must make sure that you are logged in. If you're not logged in, this page is going to send you back to the login page. This is one typical scenario where you as a programmer need to redirect the client from one page to another. There are other situations. For example, you logged in, and when you log in, press submit. If you are a valid user, then the servlet sends you to your homepage. That's another situation. So here is up to step number 3. The server decides that the request should go to a completely different URL. And let's go to next page and see what happens next. So we go from right side because now we're going from server to client. The left side is client. Now the request is at the server's side. So we go from right to left. Now the servlet calls send redirect. Here's the method that you need to remember. So this is basically the syntax. You say send redirect string URL. This is what you need to put here. Okay, this could be, let's say, a login.jsp, for example. It's basically a URL. We'll talk about relative and absolute URLs in a few slides. But for now, just remember the syntax of this method, send redirect. And inside is basically a string, which is the address or the path to your resource. So the server does that. It calls send redirect. And then the HTTP response changes the status code. You don't actually do this manually. The container does that for you. The status code changes, and the location header has a value of basically whatever URL is typed here. Then the browser gets the response. It sees that the status is 301, so it knows that this is a redirect. Okay, what happens next? So now we go from client because we're back to client. Here's the second cycle. The browser has to make a new request. So basically, when you're using send redirect, this is basically a 2-steps process. Step number 1 is when the servlet sends a new URL, and step number 2 is when the client actually sends another request. So there will be 2 requests involved with send redirect. So the browser makes a new request, and it knows what the new URL is because we have provided the new URL in the previous step. From now on, there is nothing new. It's just similar to a typical request and response. There's nothing unique about this request. The server gets the request, and it basically looks for the new resource. The HTTP response is very similar. It's just a typical HTTP response, except that it's coming from the location. It's actually not coming from the location that the client typed. And when the client sees the browser, it sees the page, he or she will be surprised because the address bar is going to be changed. So for example, if I type in www.yahoo.com, my homepage, for example, I know this page doesn't exist. I'm just doing it for the sake of demonstration. The client might initially write a URL like this. But when the browser sends back, when the server sends back the response will be coming from a different page. Let's say login. Okay. Okay. If there is any problem with my if there is any problem, can you still hear me? Because I'm out of QQ now. I'm logged out of QQ. So please tell me here. Can you still hear my voice? Can you hear my voice? Is the screen clear?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
okay, thank you. Because I'm out of QQ now. That's why I want you to speak here if I ask you any questions. Thank you. Okay, so this is about send redirect. Okay. Now let's talk about URL type. With the URL type, we have two types of URL. Okay, we have an absolute URL. An absolute URL starts with an HTTP. It's a full URL. Okay, it's a full path from the beginning. Then we have relative URL. It's a URL that doesn't start from HTTP. It either starts with a / or without a /. So this is an example of a relative URL. This is an example of a relative URL. So far in the previous examples, what we used was a relative URL. Okay. Now I want to tell you the difference between different types of URL when you're using a send redirect. So let's say, for example, this is what the user, let's say this is what the user types in first time. This is the full URL that the client types on his browser. And then we go to a servlet, and in our servlet, we have a redirect. And our redirect is this. Can you tell me if this is an absolute or a relative URL? Anybody knows if this is an absolute or a relative? So let me go back here. If you have an answer, you need to speak. Is this a relative or an absolute URL? So we know an absolute URL starts with HTTP. Is this an absolute URL? No, the answer is no, because it doesn't start with an HTTP. It's a relative URL. So when we have a send redirect that starts like this, what happens is the final URL that is going to be generated will look like this. So this part here will be added to, instead of bar.do, we will have this part. This is what the send redirect says. This happens when we use a relative URL without starting /. This is this situation. Okay, but what happens when we start with a /? Okay, so let's go to the next page. When we, so let's go to the, let's create the scenario once again. Let's say this is what the user types. Okay, I'm gonna do it here. This is what the user types, okay? And then we have a redirect that starts with /foo. This time, okay, this is not going to be added. This is not going to be added here because we started with a /. Instead, we add this to the location of our container. So our container is, in this example, is in the root, okay? So therefore, we go back all the way to the root and we add it here. This is what happens, okay? So this is basically the difference between using a relative URL that starts with a / or doesn't start with a /. Now the second example, the second way basically to send the client from one page to another is using request dispatcher. Okay, so we have two ways. First one is send redirect. So we saw send redirect as a two-step process. Then we have request dispatcher. Okay, so these two methods are different in nature, and now we're going to see how request dispatcher works. So let's go through the scenario, the steps one by one from the beginning. When the user types a servlet URL into the browser, the request goes to the server and the container, of course. And the servlet decides the request should go to another part. So up to step 3 is basically the same as send redirect. But from now on, we will start to see the differences. So here, instead of send redirect, we have get request dispatcher and forward. We have used this statements before. Okay, so we get the request dispatcher from the request object, and here is the URL. And once we create a request dispatcher object, we will have to forward it. And in this example, we will forward the request as well as response. Okay, so basically the page here will have access to the request and response objects. So here is the difference. Now the browser gets the response. It gets it in the usual way, and it shows it to the user. Okay. But since the browser location doesn't change, the user doesn't really know that JSP, basically JSP generated response. It doesn't know that the response is coming from a different URL. So with the request dispatcher, if you type something here, my homepage, and let's say the servlet decides that you need to go somewhere else, this URL is not going to change, even though you go to a different URL. So with request dispatching, there are two main methods. One is include, one is forward. We have used both of these in the last week. With include, we can include content from another resource. It could be another servlet, or it could be a JSP or an HTML page. With forward, we basically forward client from one page to another, to a different resource. Okay, so here's the difference in a diagram. Here's the forward method from request dispatching. So with the forward method, there is an initial request. It goes to the servlet. The servlet forwards the request to another servlet, and then the response is generated here. The response is generated at the servlet 2, not here. So servlet 1 creates the response, but it forwards it to servlet 2. Servlet 2 gets this response, and it generates its own response and then sends it back to the client. With the include method, things are different. Servlet 1 gets the request, and before it generates the response, it includes the content from servlet 2. So basically, before servlet 1 creates the response from servlet 2 needs to be generated. Servlet 2 generates the response. It sends it back to servlet 1, and then servlet 1 gets the response from servlet 2 and creates the final response, which will be sent back to the browser. Here is the difference between forward method and include method of request dispatcher. So basically, the going back to send redirect and request dispatching, send redirect is a two-step process, as I said before. The web application tells the browser to go to a different URL. And one of the disadvantages of send redirect is that redirect is slower, obviously, because the client needs to make two requests. Okay. And the other disadvantage is that the objects placed in the original request, like your request and response objects, they won't be available in the second request, to the second request. Okay. But with request dispatching, this forward is performed internally. Okay, so basically, if I go back to the diagram here, this forward here is happening internally, so it doesn't really go back to the client and then again back to the servlet. Okay, this forward happens internally within the servlets. So what I want to show you now is basically what we did in the last week. We did try one example last week. Let me go back to it. Okay, the project, we called it login demo. If you remember, we had a simple login form with two text boxes and a submit button. Okay, and then we had a servlet that we called authentication and welcome. In authentication, we had this code, right? So we basically got the password. If you remember, we got the password from, it's here, right? Oh, no, not this one. User pass. Okay, the password is written initially. Can you tell me where is this password written? Do you know where this password is? If you read the command, you will know that this password is coming from servlet context. It's a parameter that we have here, right? Within context param element. Okay, so basically the password is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's not a secure way to store passwords. So for part 2 of your assignment, I expect that you store login information in your database tables in a secure manner. Okay, so let me go back to authentication. We check if the password that the user enters matches the password in from the servlet context. Then we will basically forward the user to the welcome page. Okay, so let me just test send redirect. So what if we so for send redirect, we have to use the response object. What if instead of this, we sent the user to, we used send redirect to send the user to the welcome page. So this is the situation if the password is entered correctly. Do you think there will be any problem with this? We can have a look and then see if any problem arises. This one here, else part, is if the user does not enter the password correctly. We will type in, we will display an error message. And this time we'll use the include because we don't want to transfer the user to any other page. We stay at the same page, include the same page, but with a different message. So let me just go ahead and run this application and just find out if there are any problems with it. Finish. Okay, so initially I'm going to enter a wrong password, let's say TTT. So, okay, so our program is working. Sorry, you're not an authorized user, Iman. So far so good. So now let me enter correct password, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now the problem is it's saying welcome null. Can anybody tell me why is this happening? So it goes to welcome here, but it fails to get this value. Can anybody tell me why? It says welcome null instead of displaying my username. Can you guess what the problem is, or tell me if you know what it is? Have a look at this code here and tell me if you know what the problem is. So with this, we're not sending the request and response object. So basically here in the welcome page, we will not have access to, where am I now? We will not have access to this parameter because we don't have the request object. But what I'm going to do now is I will go back to authentication. Instead of using send redirect, which is a two-step process, I'm going to use request dispatcher this time, and I'm going to send the request and response to the client. Okay, so go to home, run it again. So this time, come on, 1, 2, 3. This is a wrong password. Okay. Once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one is the correct password. And as you can see, I am getting my username from the request object because this time we're actually doing the right thing and sending the request and response to the client. Any questions here? So let me close this now. Going back to our slides. With this slides, I have included this whole demonstration, put everything, and actually I've put a diagram here for you to see what's happening. Here's kind of a flow chart where we validate the client if the user enters the correct password. If the user is a valid user, we will send them to a welcome page. Otherwise, we will just display an error message using request dispatcher include method. Here is all the steps, but obviously you have the video. You don't need to go through these steps. Okay, so when we come back after the break, 10 minutes break, we will discuss session management, another very important topic in JSP. So let's take 10 minutes break and we'll come back soon.